Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Udabel Blue School tonight. Our topic is going to be labor unions and the role they play in government. And our host for tonight is going to be Bradley Turner. He is the Vice Chair for Labor for the Alabama Democratic Party. He's the chair of Claiborne County, and he's been a member of the UA Local 798 for 18 years. So Bradley, whenever you want.
Sure. Thanks. I don't know how many do we have actually here? Is it just us?
It's 7 right now.
7? Okay. I'm going to ask kind of briefly, what is kind of the knowledge base that you guys have when it comes to labor?
I personally worked as a union steward and president for
Okay.
about a decade.
So you know what's going on.
And all I know is that Republicans don't generally like unions.
Okay.
I was the union organizer.
Right. So kind of when I go around and I talk to people, I kind of like to know kind of what it is I need to talk about because labor is it's a very vast topic, depending on what you know. So I think I have a PowerPoint. That's what I'm looking at. So if it looks like I'm reading off a script, it's because I am. But I think I'm going to start from the very beginning since we have a couple that may not know really the intra workings of just a union in general. So we'll just start from the bottom and we'll get to the end. Okay. So, introduction to labor unions. What is a labor union and what is the goals that they try to incorporate? A labor union is an organization formed by workers to protect and advance their rights and interest in the workplace. There's 4 main issues that unions advocate for once they're unionized: wage and benefits, improving working conditions, securing job protections, and giving workers the opportunity to have a voice within, their employers. I messed that up. Giving workers the opportunity to have a voice in employer decisions that might affect them. What makes unions powerful? Everybody sees, workers going on strike or workers negotiating their wages. Well, collective bargaining agreements are kind of the lifeblood of unions. They give unions the teeth they need to advocate on behalf of their membership. A CBA is a legally binding contract between the employer and the labor union. The collective bargaining process begins when both sides sit down and negotiate the terms and conditions of employment. So what all is negotiated within a CBA? One thing is wages. That incorporates pay scales, raises, overtime hours, shifts, things like that. Hours of work, scheduling, breaks, benefits, healthcare, retirement plans, paid leave, working conditions, which includes safety protocols and equipment standards. What kind of PPE, personal protective equipment, are you going to need if you're working a dangerous job? Job protections, which is, disciplinary procedures or termination rules. The great thing about CBAs is, let's say somebody makes a mistake. It's not too terrible. Yeah, it's not great. Well, they can't just get fired. There is a process that has to be played out. Seniority rules, promotions and layoffs, grievance procedures. That's how disputes are solved, if workers fighting with another worker. There's a process that goes through all that. And then, union rights are the last thing that's kind of negotiated within a CBA. That's your dues collection and the union's access to the work site if they need to get there to investigate, an issue. Okay, this is a question I kind of get a lot of, how to form a union. There are people out there that, they call me, they're like, hey, I want things to kind of get better for myself and for my workers. What we got to do to make that happen? Organizing your workplace can be really challenging, but also really rewarding if you're successful. There's 6 main steps to follow when you want to organize. First step, you have to talk to your coworkers. You have to figure out where their head is at, because you can't do it by yourself. You got to have a lot of like-minded individuals who also want to make things better for themselves. In my opinion, this is one of the most crucial steps, because if you don't have others that are wanting to do what you want to do, then you're never going to make it any further. It's very important because of laws and regulations. Workers must have informal conversations amongst each other to see if there's a big enough interest in organizing. They can't be standing next to each other while they're, working on the assembly line or whatever. That's got to be during a break or, outside of work. Can't be during official work time. But building a core group of supporters is essential to organizing. Strength in numbers is always the key. Step number 2, you got to contact the union. While, workers can form an independent union on their own, I would highly recommend reaching out to an established union for advice. The UAW, CWA, the Teamsters, kind of, any of them are very good at organizing workplaces if you're to reach out. Established unions can bring resources, experience, legal assistance, whatever it is, they'll assess kind of the viability if you have a chance to organize your workplace. And if, they will always attempt to help you do that if you so choose to do. Step number 3, you have to build a majority of support. Organizers from step 2 will come in and educate workers about what a union is and the benefits that it brings. This is the step where you start collecting union authorization cards. You all may remember that this was kind of a big thing with Mercedes last year, because there was about, I don't know, when it was all said and done, they had about 60% of the workers had signed authorization cards, which basically tells the organizers, hey, we might have enough people that want to go for it. The legal threshold to hold an election is 30% of all the employees that work. That's the minimum. Most organizers aim for 60 to 70% before they file with the NLRB, just to kind of play it safe. They want to make sure that, we win when we do this, because the reality is if you have to come back later, you're probably not going to have as much support the second and third and, however many times you want to go, you do it. Let's see, step 4, kind of mentioned you file for an NLRB election. NLRB is the National Relations Board. They oversee union elections within the private sector. The union or organizing committee will submit all the authorization cards and file a petition for an election to take place. The NLRB will then schedule an election in the future. And I'd also point out, when they do that, they look into, how many workers are at the plant or, business, and what is a reasonable amount of time for all of them to come in. They look at shifts, they look at everything to make sure everyone has the ability to vote. Mercedes, there was about 6,000 workers. They had, I want to say, about a week for everybody to vote. Step number 5, you have the election process. Workers will vote on a simple ballot, yes or no. These ballots are cast in secret. That keeps the workers safe from discrimination or bullying or anything like that. If the majority of these votes are yes votes, the union is officially certified. But I will tell you that most of the time, it doesn't matter if it's a yes or a no. The results are usually contested if it's close. It's just kind of a formality anymore. One side will say the other side cheated, and it's just it's a mess. Step 6 is the collective bargaining phase. After successfully organizing, the group of workers sit down and they elect representatives to negotiate on behalf of everybody. Once this has happened, union reps and the employer must begin negotiations in good faith to form CBA. And now a lot of people hear the in good faith and kind of wonder, what does that mean? To put it in kind of layman's terms, you have to come to the table with a reasonable deal. If I was representing my group and said, hey, we deserve $200 an hour, that's not operating in good faith, because you're you're not going to get that. And that goes for employers as well when they try to lowball people and groups. Sometimes these negotiations can take a while. I mean, if you remember, I want to say it was last year, you had some Starbucks across the country, and I want to say some Amazon plants that, the workers organized, and Amazon and Starbucks kind of drug their feet. And, the process, went to court, and eventually they had to sit down to negotiate. But, they didn't want to, and they tested the system, and the system ended up working for our workers. So that's always a good thing. When workers are organizing, there are legal rights that are protected by the NLRA. During this process, during those steps, it is illegal for an employer to fire or discipline you for organizing. They can't spy on you. They can't threaten you. They can't intimidate you. They can't do anything that would mess with the process. Do they do it? Of course they do. But we try very hard to keep our eyes and ears open, to see if they are doing that stuff, because that is a reportable offense. Another thing that sometimes companies or businesses will do is they'll offer raises or benefits to stop union activity. They'll find out who one of the main organizers within the employees are, and they'll go to him or her and say, hey, if you kind of let this go, we'll double your salary and give you rank advancement. That kind of stuff is very real. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It all depends on the person. But workers are protected while talking about union activities on breaks, before or after work, and in non-work areas. Kind of touched on that a little bit ago. Union and politics. Let's see. In this particular chapter, I'm going to talk about public and private sector unions. I'm going to talk into more detail about the National Labor Relations Board. I'm going to talk about the AFL-CIO, the Alabama AFL-CIO, and the Central Labor Councils within Alabama. I'm going to talk about Alabama's anti-union legislation history, talk about unions and democratic politics, and we'll also talk about Democrats' role in advocating for unions and working class people. So, a lot of people think that when someone is in a union, it's just kind of one big group. That's not the case. You have two different kinds of unions. You have a public sector and you have a private sector. Your public sector unions mainly covers government agencies, teachers, police officers, something, if it has to do with the public, the general public, then it's probably a public sector job. These laws are dictated by the state that you live in. We live in Alabama. Teachers here can't strike or negotiate a contract. because the state has basically made it illegal to do that. Public sector unions are not protected by the NLRB. Now, I will say that federal workers, they do not have the right to strike because of Taft-Hartley. Prime example of this would kind of be the dock workers at the end of last year and early this year. They're considered federal employees because they work on the docks and in the bays that are controlled by the United States. How our conservative leadership pushed that, because if you remember, about 50% of our imported goods come through the Gulf. And so, Kay Ivey and all them, they were blaming Biden and everything else because, the president does have the ability to end strikes, but he did not want to get in the way of their negotiating process. He was told, and I know this, but he was told that, an agreement was going to happen probably. And so he stayed out of the way. There are instances where, if the dock workers were to go on strike for a year, that would really be bad. But, the reality is what nobody ever reported with the dock workers is the whole reason they wanted better conditions and better wages and all is because the umbrella corporation that they work under cleared $370 billion last year alone. That's a lot of money. And they're also worried about automation, which, can take their job in the future. That's something that, we're going to have to really, as labor as a whole, we're going to have to really figure out how to tackle that. So that's public sector workers. Then we go to private sector. This is comprised mainly of private companies, corporations, and non-governmental employees. These groups are protected under the National Labor Relations Board. They have the right to negotiate CBAs, and strike under almost any circumstance. So let's kind of dive into the National Labor Relations Board a little bit, into some details.
Before we continue, Bradley, would it be
Yes.
okay to pause and ask if anyone has any questions?
Yeah, sure.
about anything?
Absolutely.
All right. Does anyone have any questions about anything that he said so far?
I do. I think I'm on mute though.
I
No?
can hear you.
We can hear
Okay,
you.
good. All right. Give us an example of a private sector. You gave us some examples of the public sector.
Sure.
When I worked in newspaper, I remember I had to sign some sort of a form stating that I would not join a union.
Sure. So a public sector would be kind of like pipe fitters, IBEW, that's electrical engineers, UAW, auto workers, Teamsters. They're a private sector union. There's a lot, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Starbucks would be private union as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that kind of answer your
Yeah,
question?
no, I get it. You just mentioned all the public ones, and I thought, well, tell us what the private ones are.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah,
Gotcha.
I think, when we get into Alabama, I think the only, and I don't know, I was just kind of looking over some things. I think the only group of workers that have the ability to negotiate is the firefighters. I could be wrong with that. That just kind of stuck out to me. There's something the firefighters get to do that nobody else can do. I'm not exactly, I can't put my mind on what it is exactly, but I just remember reading, I thought that's odd. I wonder why they get special treatment and nobody else. But no, is there any more questions on anything that we've talked about?
Well, so any private business, big or small, the employees could unionize.
They could. That's right. And I'll just give an example. If Tom Miro and the office staff down in Montgomery wanted to organize, they could.
Okay,
if they wanted to. That's just an example came to mind.
right.
But
I
yeah,
think
it could be-
recently, Alabama Rise unionized as well. Um,
Yeah. I think
so
so.
nonprofits can unionize as well.
Yeah. I mean, it could be 2 people, it could be 4 people, it could be 400 or 4,000, as long as you have enough, you just need 50% plus one to get recognized.
All right, thanks.
Mhm. Sure.
So if a company does somehow threaten or punish employees for even talking about unionizing, because that's one of my biggest fears is, you know, on our breaks before after work, talk about it, but if somehow they found out, they told, if I trusted the wrong person and they could just fire me. What mechanisms, what would be the first step to reporting? I'm guessing I mean, I would lose my job, but there's no kind of insurance or anything like that.
So it kind of, if if your group, if your work is in the process of organizing, you've begun any of those 6 steps. Uh, if you're on a break, as long as you're not doing work, uh, in theory, you're protected. Now, you're absolutely right. There are plants. There are people will set up cameras. And wires. They're not supposed to do that. But if someone is really anti-union enough, they're going to do whatever they think they can do to stop it from happening. And so, what I would recommend personally is just kind of meet up off the property, because they can't use that. Even if someone tattled, they can't use that against you. So that would kind of be my advice, meet up and for lunch or
Seeing as
dinner,
this is a
whatever.
right to work state, they could still do it and say that, oh, it's because of your performance.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that is absolutely right. We live in a state that, it's not about empowering you, it's about empowering whoever you work for. And so, that is kind of what you touched on. I'm going to try not to go off on a tangent here, but that mindset that you have is one of the big reasons that we struggle to unionize in a lot of places, because some of these people, we live in Alabama, minimum wage is 7.25. A lot of people, they'll work retail or fast food, and it's nothing against those jobs, but say they go and they get a job at Honda, right? Or somewhere that pays significantly more than what they were making, you know more than likely they're going to be perfectly content with making more money than listening to someone saying, hey, you should unionize, we can do better, because they're afraid. Fear is real. They get told all the time, if you unionize, it's going to close and then you won't have a job. And it's just, a lot of that stuff is not true. Could it happen? Sure. But there's a lot of mechanisms in place. You're not just going to get dumped on the street. There's exit plans, and a lot of that is negotiated in CBAs. We'll take Goodyear, for example, up in Gadsden a few years ago. Gosh, it's more than a few years ago. But, you know, every one of those workers that got laid off, they got some form of compensation. And that was negotiated, before Goodwill went to Mexico. Uh, but yeah, I mean, the amount of time that it also takes to unionize, you're talking about months. A lot of people, they're not used to this kind of pressure, I guess, so to speak. And so, over time, they start thinking that, something's going to go wrong, or, it's just not worth it. And so, it's just that's what kind of makes it hard to organize in Alabama, is because people are content with what they have, because our state doesn't do worth a darn when with things that they should be doing.
I think Susan has her hand up.
Yes, in reference to Brian's original statement or question was about his concerns. By notifying the National Labor Relations Board, once you enter into that, it sounds like that does offer you some layer of protection, that another entity has some knowledge of what you've been working on. And I mean, can you address that a little bit?
Sure. So, this kind of, when you're talking about the NLRB, it has to be in a private sector area. They can't legally cover a state, a state law, which states are in charge of public workers. And when it comes to private unions and private sector workers, the NLRB covers that. So it just kind of depends on if it ultimately depends on what sector you're in. If you're a public sector worker in Alabama, you're at the mercy of the state. There's just really no other way to put it. If you do attempt to unionize in the private sector, you do have that layer of protection from the NLRB. Doesn't mean it's bulletproof, but you do have it. And that's kind of, during these union drives, you'll see it's very common to have a lawsuit or two because somebody feels like they're being targeted or treated unfairly. It's fairly common.
Would it be safe to say that blue states are more union friendly or have better protections than
Absolutely. I
red
mean,
states?
you look at California or Washington or Oregon, and that they allow their they allow their public sector workers to unionize and negotiate, and they're a little bit more stingent on strikes, because at the end of the day, they still don't want people to strike for too long. But strikes were never meant to shut down a business, for an extended period of time. The whole point of a strike is to kind of get the workers' attention. Hey, you need to look at us, value us a little bit more than what you are, and you're going to lose money until you recognize us. That's the whole point of a strike. And unfortunately for some of these bigger companies, Amazon or whatever, they have infinite dollars and they literally can just wait it out. They'll just wait until the workers get tired, or literally they're not making any money while they're on strike. So they just wait it out, which is that didn't used to be the issue. But some of these bigger companies, that's we don't have the money and the resources of an Amazon or a Starbucks. you know but yes, blue states offer way more pro labor, pro worker rights than red ones.
Awesome, thank you. I think Robert had a question in the comments. Does Warrior Coal Fund fall under that umbrella?
Warrior Coal, I believe they are a private sector. The coal miners union is a private sector union, but that's turned into a big mess. That turned into a very big legal argument, and I believe that's what the argument was about. You know, they went on strike, and literally, Warrior Coal Met just sat them out. What that went on for almost a year and a half, I believe, and eventually the miners had to go back to work. I know that wasn't a great answer, but I believe that's how that played out.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Drummond Coal is a private unit. That's what I thought. Thank you for the clarification.
Any other questions? If not, we can continue on, right, Melanie?
Sure thing.
Yes.
Okay.
So, National Labor Relations Board is an independent federal agency that protects workers' rights to organize and engage in collective bargaining in the private sector. It was established in 1935 under the Wagner Act. The four main functions of the NLRB are to conduct free and fair union elections and certifying the results, investigating and resolving unfair labor practices, enforcing collective bargaining rights, and protecting all workers, including non-union workers. A lot of people don't realize that non-union workers are the beneficiaries of private sector unions as well. Even though they may not be in one, they still get extended the same rights as a union does. So, who sits on the board? The board consists of 5 members appointed by the President of the United States. These appointments must be approved by the U.S. Senate. And if they are appointed, they serve 5-year terms. Now, these positions are supposed to be staggered. So, you don't have, complete control one way or the other. Now, if you all remember a few months ago when Trump took office, he immediately fired the top NLRB board member. If I remember correctly, there was already I want to say there was an absence already. So that dropped it down to 3, which basically nullified anything the NLRB could do. Now, that may not seem too terrible, but within labor, that is a very alarming thing because the NLRB is what enforces, it's the government entity that makes people play right. And so if you take that away, we still can advocate and fight, but it enables bad behavior from companies, to just not participate, which we have seen. I do believe, though, that those 2 positions have been filled again. The one lady was reinstated, and I believe Trump nominated somebody, and I believe that person passed. Let's see. There are 26 regional offices across the United States. I don't have a list of where they are, but I didn't realize that there were that many. That's a pretty significant amount. I would almost bet that most of them are in blue states. Are there any questions any more about the NLRB? Okay, cool. So now we're going to go dive into the AFL-CIO. The acronym, it's a mouthful, but it's the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. It is the largest federation of labor unions in the United States. There's over 60 plus unions affiliated with the AFL-CIO. So basically, how this works, you have, we'll say the IBEW or, the United Association, pipe fitters, steam fitters, all of them will say, hey, we're advocating in our own little areas, but we want to affiliate with you because y'all are the guys that advocate legislation in Congress. We don't have the time to do it. The AFL-CIO does, which is the primary function of the AFL-CIO, is to advocate legislation in Congress and state legislatures for pro-worker laws. Each state has a federation that is affiliated with the AFL-CIO. Ours is the Alabama AFL-CIO. It's basically does the same thing in Montgomery. It's just, it's just not on the federal level. Any questions about the AFL-CIO?
Was there any push this past legislative session from the Alabama AFL-CIO as far as trying to get bills passed?
So this is kind of tricky with the legislature composition the way that it is. You kind of remember last year you had SB 231, and everybody got riled up, and we tried to push back on that, and we weren't successful. We do have legislatures that are Democrats that we approach, and I'm not trying to say anything bad on them, but basically, what they tell us is, we can bring it up, but there's not going to be it'll never make it out of committee. And so, we would rather focus on things, and, I don't agree with this, but, they would rather focus on things that have a chance to pass. And so, I get it, I understand it, but to answer your question, the answer is no. There was not any, labor related, to my knowledge, there was not any labor related bills that were filed.
Thank you.
And that's just because it's a supermajority. Now, I will say this, there are some Republicans, they won't admit it, that are down there, but they're more labor friendly than they want people to know. But obviously they're not gonna lead the charge, and they
Which
kind
is
of get
strange
held.
because didn't Trump try to get the Teamsters votes? So it seems like sometimes they are for unions and sometimes they aren't.
Yeah, so obviously Trump says a lot of things, and he never, there's never any return value, I think is the best way to put it. But he's a con man. That's just the best way to put it, and he's very good at it, because he convinced people in 2016. He lost in 2020. Okay, there's no doubt about it. He lost, and he conned enough people to make it close enough this time. Kind of reading news articles and stuff, seems like that there might have been some election interference there. I try not to go down that road, but there's a lot of interesting things to look at. But kind of back to what we're talking about, yes, Trump, the Republican Party, and I will admit there are a lot of union workers that vote Republican in the state of Alabama. I hate it. And the rationale for them doing that is they just, they think the Democratic Party has fallen away from, the workers. That's their mentality. Now, when they come to me and they say that, I say, hey man, that's crazy, because if, our legislature and our governor had it their way, you wouldn't even have a job. You wouldn't be in a union at all. But, it's just kind of, they've drunk the Kool-Aid, and Trump promises a lot of things, and I believe I saw something where, I don't exactly remember the exact legislation, but Josh Hawley introduced a pro I say pro labor, it's it looks like a pro labor bill, and I want to say that it would force companies to the table within 10 days of somebody, of a group organizing. I don't know whatever happened with that, but I thought that was very interesting, because that was something that Josh Hawley, who's a Republican senator, and Trump actually pushed for that too. Now, is Trump pro labor? No, he is not. But one of the things that probably people have noticed is, with the tariffs, is some of the unions have actually come out and said that tariffs under certain circumstances would not be all that bad. The one that comes to mind is UAW. Said, hey, if tariffs bring manufacturing jobs back, that's a good thing. And, sure, in reasoning, that's right. But the thing about doing that is, you're not talking about a job or a manufacturer coming back and then instantly starting up. Okay, you're talking about, goodness, and I'm probably being lenient here, you're talking of at least 5 years before they're up and running, doing what they're doing. but it's just not how the world works anymore. You know, companies go where it's cheap to make stuff because a lot of consumers buy cheap things. And that's just the truth. Sorry, I kind of went off on a rabbit hole there talking about some of that stuff.
No, but you can definitely see that in UAW posts from their workers and stuff.
Right, right.
They are very much pro-Trump, pro tariffs.
Yeah, and it's
And it's very confusing because you've got a lot of good people in the UAW that don't like that talk, and then you have, I don't know if it's a majority, but they're a boisterous group of people on that in that union.
It's it's a large amount. I'm not gonna lie about it. And it's something that the leadership of these bigger unions, they know the truth, but at the end of the day, they get elected by their peers.
Yeah.
And so, when they know that 50 or 60% of their membership votes a certain way, they may not full jump in, but they're gonna at least wade in the water a little bit.
But I think that a lot of that talk is, like you said, it's going to be, if it did happen and tariffs were effective, it would take a decade to get those manufacturing plants up and running, if not longer.
That's right.
But you wouldn't sustain the tariffs that long.
That's right.
That would be another market shift.
The way I look at it, when Trump is gone, the tariffs are going to be gone too.
Yeah,
exactly. That's just, unless we have some,
and
Trump
see,
2.0.
Trump himself is backpedaling on the tariffs, so they're not as effective as they would have been in that plan that would have possibly worked long term.
In
nothing
theory,
is going right.
I will say, in theory, tariffs are, they're questionable, but in a perfect world, you can kind of see the logic in it, but we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a very, capitalistic world where companies are going to go where they can make the most money. And it doesn't matter if you tariff India or China or Taiwan or wherever, they're going to go to a place you don't pick and they're going to set up shop because they're in it to make money.
So what can we as Democrats do to help support unions?
Sure. Trying to think of how to say this. The best way that Democrats can support unions is, we all gotta organize, strategize, and mobilize. We gotta find candidates that will, be pro worker, and we gotta get them elected. That's the first thing. In Alabama, we can't do much until our elected leadership changes. That's the political angle of it. The other thing I would talk about would be, we have, like I mentioned, in Alabama, we have 8 labor councils within the Alabama AFL-CIO. You have the Central, you have the North, you have Northeast, you have the River region, you have the Shoals region, you have Southwest region, you have West Alabama, and you have the Wiregrass. Reach out. I would recommend reaching out to them, asking them how you could help. There's always different projects in different areas that these councils are working on, trying to, improve worker rights. Let me see here. I had a list. It's just further down the PowerPoint. Let's see. The other thing is, Democrats are passionate. There's no doubt about it. We're good at fighting, regardless of what people say. We are good at fighting. It's just unfortunate. We're really good at fighting each other. And so, what I would recommend is find a cause that you can get behind, whether it's minimum wage or, worker safety, whatever it is. Find a cause that you can get behind, and you find like-minded people and you advocate for it. There are, labor is always looking for friends to help push for this stuff. You know, we kind of have a motto, and you know, it's, you know, united we bargain, divided we beg. You know, it's couldn't be any more truer today. But you know, if we don't group up, you know, and fight as one, you know, advocate as one, you know, and you know, I use this lesson within the Democratic Party because, as we all know, there's a lot of division. But you know, if we ever could figure that out, you know, we could go a whole lot further down the road with a lot of things. We just gotta, you know, it's just that part is hard because people are stubborn. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. But yeah, so kind of the other thing that, you know, what Democrats can do. When you look at, when you ask, if you were to go out in your community and ask somebody, you know, what is your perception of a union? It's probably going to be bad. You know, the messaging around unions in Alabama is not good. Okay. You know, people have been told a lot of different things. Most of them are inaccurate. But, you know, as Democrats, you know, we have to begin changing the perception of people, you know, what people are thinking about unions and workers in general. It doesn't have to be unions, you know. Hey man, aren't you tired of making minimum wage? You know, you know, we have to message better is what I'm trying to hit at, you know. And it's hard. It's not going to change overnight because people, you know, people are a creature of habit, and you know, they will wake up and they will, you know, do what they do, and they will say, well, you know, that sounds all good, but that doesn't help me. You know, they don't like change. Change is scary, but change is necessary. If we're ever going to, you know, move the working class in Alabama to a better place, you know, it's going to require change, and people have to be okay with that.
Okay. Is there anything, anybody have any other questions?
All right, I don't have a question, but if you were to take the word labor or union and put any other marginalized group in that, what you've been saying, it just sounds like that. Thank goodness we're all together, because we need each other. There is no doubt that labor needs us. LGBTQ needs us. Hispanics need us. It's incredible, the mindset. And you're right, it's messaging. Somehow we have been made, all these categories, to be the bad people, the evil ones, when all we're trying to do is make sure everybody is treated fairly. So you're right, nothing changes until we elect good people.
That's right. And you know, we advocate, you know, if, you know, with labor, we advocate for everybody. We don't care about, you know, titles or any of that. You know, we look at it, human being deserves better. Let's go. You know, we don't look at race, creed, color. We don't look at any of that stuff. It doesn't matter. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we care about moving the working class to a place to where, you know, they don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to exist. You know, that's kind of the other thing about it too, is, you know, our country and Alabama, you know, people are struggling. They a lot of them live in poverty, and the ones that are making it, you know, they're an accident away, or a major, you know, health issue away from having nothing. And so, you know, that's got to change, you know. And saying that, it brings up something I want to kind of hit on real quick. uh and this probably would go more for, you know, unions within the state, you know, state government and whatnot. But, you know, in Alabama, we have a healthcare crisis going on right now. We have people falling through coverage gaps. We have potentially more people not going to have health insurance. You know, hospitals, the ones that we have left, Most of them are trying to figure out how to stay open. And I just kind of want to point out something. Most unions have some kind of healthcare plan. It may not be extensive, but most of them have some kind of health benefits plan. And one way, and I will advocate this until I'm blue in the face, but one way that the state of Alabama could somewhat get out of this mess is if they would just get out of the way and let us do our job. Because if we were able to organize more people would be under healthcare coverage within unionization. And it is a potential way to solve this disastrous policy that we have going on in Alabama. It's not going to fix everything, but it would help. It's just one of those things that would help. Same thing with, we hear a lot about workforce development. Well, guess what? A lot of our unions have apprentice programs. They get paid while they're learning how to do, journeyman level work. Let us get into the trade schools, work with us. Don't work against us, work with us, then we can train people, in skilled trades the way that they need to be trained. I'm not saying that, trade schools to do a bad job. They do a good job. But what makes unions so special when it comes to skilled trades is the fact that we are the best at what we do. And we are the most efficient. We do it fast, we do it right, and that's where we make our money. Because when we do it fast and we guarantee our work, that makes companies happy.
What is one of the messaging or talking points from Republicans that is more common, and what is something that we can say to fight against it?
So one of the big points that I hear, and I hear this amongst some Democrats too, I've had to kind of crack down on them. Some of the people on the STC have come to me and said, well, if, Mercedes unionizes, won't that just make the company leave? And so kind of, the big talking point is if you unionize some of these bigger places, okay, we'll take the automotive industry as an example here. All the big manufacturers are non-union. There's some parts makers within the state that are unionized, but you're talking about a handful. If one of those big ones unionizes, it's going to be like dominoes. Okay, because if you remember when the big three up north renegotiated their contracts and their deals, it took 2 days for Honda here. They looked at what those workers up north got, and they did everything they could to kind of mimic that, because they knew that if there was too much of a gap, that the workers would say, oh, well, look at what they got. We want that too. And so, the auto manufacturers here are very smart in how they, they give a lot of incentives. And, I'm not saying they treat their workers terrible, but, they don't always follow through either. But, the one reason, if y'all remember, Kay Ivey called the automobile makers here the crown jewel of the state. The reason they are so hell-bent on keeping them non-union, it's all about union density. I want to say Alabama right now is, I don't know, in the 40s somewhere when it comes to union density. Union density is, how many union workers are within a state. If all of those auto manufacturer companies unionized or were forced to unionize, you know what our union density rank would jump up to? Number one. We would be the number one state in regards to union density. And they are terrified about that because in their mind, if that happens, everything's going to leave. But, we are still pushing very hard to get one of those auto manufacturers to, the workers there to organize. And, we almost had it in Mercedes. And, those workers didn't go anywhere. And there's going to be another vote there. I don't know when it will be, but, it's going to happen again.
I know down in Mobile, there was efforts to unionize at Airbus. I'm not sure where they are with that right now, but I'm thinking, as Democrats, we can reach out to the folks who are trying to unionize and try to help them out as much as possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the thing about it is, sometimes these workers will go outside. They're not striking, but they'll have signs and they'll be out there advocating for it. And if we were to go and increase the number size, it has the appearance of, there's more people that are for it. And so and even if a union is picketing or striking, if you can go, just go stand. I mean, I'm not going to promise you won't get arrested, but show solidarity, because sometimes it feels like we're just kind of out there by ourselves. But yeah, I mean, it's all about unity and showing up for each other.
Sounds great. Melanie, I think we're reaching the end of our time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bradley. Once again, that was Bradley Turner, and he is the Vice Chair for Labor with the Alabama Democratic Party. And just a few moments of business. Our next Blue School will be July 15th from 7 to 8 again. And I hope to see you all there.
Before we go, Susan had a question.
Sure.
I was going to ask Bradley if he wouldn't mind providing a list of contacts for those regional AFL-CIO
Sure thing.
councils that you talked about.
Yeah.
If there's 8 of them, maybe that's something we can share to our county chairs with a message of
Yes.
getting in contact with them.
So the cool thing about it is, along with the contact information, we have kind of like a little map, and it actually lists all the counties that are
Perfect.
in there. So
Okay,
it'll
let's
be a
you
good
and I
thing.
try to get this ready, because we've got a meeting of the county chairs in a week. And if we can present that to them that evening, that would be great.
Sure.
All
Let me
right,
write that
so
down. We'll work
I
on
want
that.
a slide of the contacts and the map you spoke of.
Thanks. Man, I'll get that to you.
Okay, PowerPoint.
And if there's ever anybody here, or you guys, people come to you asking questions, I'm always available to answer questions. That's kind of the biggest thing for me is I want people to know that I'm always here and I'm always available.
Thank you so much, Bradley, for talking.
Thanks for having me.
Learning
It's actually
lots.
fun.
Awesome. All right. Good night, everybody.
See ya. Thank you.
Good meeting you guys. Thank you.
Same. Bye.